the dawn of the Third Punic War rose like a slow shadow, a harbinger of a destiny that seemed already written in the memories of the two powers that had contested dominion of the Mediterranean for a century. Rome, now master of the West, observed with growing anxiety the economic rebirth of Carthage, the city that had dared to challenge Hannibal and which, although deprived of the empire of the past, showed an unexpected vitality. Tensions with the Numidian king Massinissa, a faithful ally of the Romans, provided the spark to reopen a conflict that had never really subsided. His incursions into the Carthaginian territories, conducted with the tacit approval of the Senate, forced Carthage to react beyond the limits imposed by the treaties, a sufficient pretext for Rome, which was only waiting for the opportunity to definitively annihilate its rival. When the Roman ambassadors arrived in Africa to present the ultimatum, the Punic city attempted extreme submission to avoid war. He delivered hostages, then weapons and war machines in an uninterrupted flow that seemed to empty the arsenals. But the final request, the order to evacuate the city and rebuild it away from the sea, went beyond all acceptable limits. It was then that Carthage chose resistance. The lost weapons were replaced with desperate efforts. Slaves, freemen, foreigners were recruited, craft new ballistae and shields, even women cut their hair to make twist cords for catapults. Rome, surprised by the determination of the enemy, understood that the operation would not be quick. Roman forces arrived in Africa in the spring of 149 BC, led by the consuls Manlius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus. The legions, powerful in their order, were armed with gladii, heavy rectangular shields, throwing spears and an armament governed by a tested tradition. Carthage opposed citizen militias, African auxiliary troops, marksmen and slingers, with heterogeneous and often improvised equipment. Nonetheless, the city had a long experience of siege warfare and a network of imposing walls, built in times when the Punic power had dominated the sea. The architects were impressed when they saw the structures, a triple wall in the land area, over 20 meters high, with towers, internal stables for horses and warehouses for war machines. The sight alone was enough to discourage even the most confident army. The Romans established their first main camp near Utica, a historic ally and gateway to Carthaginian territory. The city immediately accepted their presence, providing logistical support. It was here that the first major military maneuver of the war occurred. Censorinus attempted to establish an advanced siege, taking advantage of the proximity to the coastal roads to receive supplies and transport the heavy siege engines. Manlius Manilius, for his part, tried to coordinate a more direct attack on the city, but the distance and the marshy terrain complicated any movement. The Battle of Utica was not a pitched battle in the traditional sense, but rather a series of failed maneuvers. The Romans attempted to use catapults and siege towers to strike a preliminary blow against the external defensive positions, but the Punic resistance was solid. The Carthaginian army, commanded by Hasdrubal the Boeotarch, implemented a tactic of containment and disturbance. He never offered a large-scale direct confrontation, preferring rapid sorties from the walls and flank attacks which, while not decisive, prevented the Romans from consolidating their positions. The Roman machines were set on fire several times. Attempts to create access ramps were dismantled with daring night assaults. Censorinus was forced to withdraw his troops to safer ground to avoid unnecessary losses, realizing that Utica would not be the easy gateway to Carthage he had imagined. The real setback for the legions came shortly thereafter, at the Bagradas camp. Here Hasdrubal decided for the first time to face the Romans in an open field, counting on more favorable terrain and the presence of expert African troops. The Carthaginian army, although inferior in discipline, enjoyed a certain numerical superiority and good knowledge of the territory. The forces consisted of heavy citizen infantry, Libyan contingents with oval shields and long spears, difficultly recruited Numidian cavalry units and some elephants, although not as numerous as in previous wars. Manlius Manilius, eager to redeem the unsuccessful siege of Utica, accepted the challenge and deployed the legions according to the usual tripartite order, with advanced velites and cavalry at the flanks. The Italian auxiliaries guarded the most inaccessible terrain. Rome still counted on its superior tactical discipline and the resistance of the maniples, but Hasdrubal had prepared a careful plan. After luring the Romans onto slightly higher ground, he moved the first line back to create an apparent breach. The Roman advance, ordinary and methodical, transformed into an extension of the lines. When the maniples attempted to fill the space, the Carthaginian cavalry and elephants attacked the flanks, forcing the outermost units to fall back in disorder. The chronology of the clash recorded hours of intense combat. The Velites tried to stop the elephants with darts and improvised fires, but the initial impact was still devastating. The second Roman line, composed of the hastati, quickly closed to contain the pressure, but the insistence of the enemy cavalry prevented them from reorganizing. When the Punic heavy infantry returned to the attack, the Roman front began to give way, and Manilius, fearing encirclement, gave the order to retreat towards the initial positions. The maneuver was only partially successful. Many auxiliarum fell in the escape, and the retreat left an impression of disorder which the Carthaginians exploited to celebrate a symbolic victory, precious for morale. The Bagradas field represented one of the first major setbacks for Rome. Although the losses were not devastating, the psychological impact was strong. The consuls understood that Carthage was not a city on its last legs ready to surrender, but a power still capable of organizing a methodical and intelligent resistance. Hasdrubal himself emerged as a more skilled commander than expected, capable of exploiting the enemy's logistical and tactical weaknesses. The final phase of this first year of war saw Rome in difficulty. Diseases, fueled by the unhealthy climate around the Tunisian marshes, decimated the contingents. Siege engines, already in short supply, were being destroyed faster than they could be built. The tactical initiative remained in the hands of the Carthaginians, who preferred slow attrition to a head-on clash. The Roman army, although imposing, appeared too rigid in the face of an enemy who had made mobility and ingenuity his main weapon. And so the first year of the war ended, with Rome frustrated and Carthage surprisingly intact. The siege had not even begun in the most concrete sense, and it was already clear that the clash would require a different commander, one capable of transforming inertia into iron will. But that would be the task of the following year, when Scipio Aemilianus would enter the scene. For now, Africa and the Mediterranean were holding their breath. The war was only just beginning, and neither of the two powers seemed willing to give in. The second year of the war, 148 BC, opened under the sign of uncertainty and usury. The Romans, having recovered from initial difficulties, found themselves forced to reconsider the entire operational apparatus. The forces deployed by Carthage, although imperfect and sometimes improvised, had demonstrated their ability to exploit the terrain, their walls and enemy hesitations. The failure of the maneuvers near Utica and the setback at the Bagradas camp had dented the reputation of the Roman commanders, especially of Calpurnius Piso, who became consul and responsible for the continuation of the operations. Rome, however, could not afford a prolonged conflict. The prestige of the Republic, the pride of the senators and the very order of the provinces depended on the ability to conclude the campaign with a clear and definitive victory. Piso, eager to redeem the honor of the legions, attempted to change the tactical approach. He believed that continuing to insist on maneuvers too close to the city would only lead to unnecessary losses, and therefore decided to strike the external and secondary positions first, with the aim of progressively isolating Carthage from its hinterland. However, the African terrain often contradicted expectations. Eroded hills, unhealthy swamps and irregular rivers prevented complex operations. The Romans found themselves forced to continually move the camps, with physical wear and tear that reduced the effectiveness of the units. The nights were spent in constant vigilance, because the Carthaginians, aware of their global strategic inferiority, tried to inflict damage with rapid and unpredictable sorties, especially against supply lines and isolated units. It was in this climate of continuous tension that the Carthaginians began to radically modify their defensive structure. The enormous effort made in 149, when they had remade weapons and armor, almost from scratch, continued in 148 with incessant production. The walls were filled in, repaired, reinforced. New towers were erected in the most vulnerable areas. The neighborhoods near the land gates were reorganized to allow the rapid passage of troops. The Punic workshop masters, many of whom came from the now lost provinces, demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity. Lighter catapults, improved ballistas, harpoons to set fire to Roman mobile towers, shields made of plant fiber to repel incendiary arrows. Piso understood that direct pressure on the walls would have an uncertain outcome, but, despite this, he decided to attempt an assault against the vast western wall anyway. His trust was placed in the experience of the legions and in the belief that, sooner or later, the Carthaginian resistance would give way. He had large earth ramps built to reach the tops of the walls, counting on the superiority in the number of engineers and workers, often prisoners or slaves. However, Carthage, protected by the height of its structures and the crossfire of its machines, responded with determination. The history of those weeks shows an uninterrupted series of failed attempts. Each ramp was laboriously constructed, only to be set on fire at night. Each siege tower was dragged forward, only to be hit by incendiary shells and crumbled before reaching a useful point. The Punic militias, positioned on the summits, threw stones, javelins and bundles of burning wood. Several times the Roman maniples were forced to retreat, leaving dozens of casualties under the walls. In parallel with his land-based attempts, Piso tried to open a front in the port, convinced that the sea could offer him a maneuverable advantage that land denied. He gathered much of the Roman fleet and ordered his navarchs to inspect the Carthaginian port defenses. The city still possessed a fleet, albeit a small one, but its maritime works remained impressive. The Kothon, the double internal port originally intended for trade and war, was protected by high walls and a narrow, easily defensible entrance. The humiliation suffered years earlier, when he had handed over almost all his ships to the Romans, had not stopped the Carthaginians from building others, at least those necessary to defend access to internal waters. The first naval operation was an attempt to sink some Roman ships in an unplanned sortie. The Punic triremes and quinquiremes left the port in close order, taking advantage of surprise and knowledge of the seabed. The Carthaginian naval commander, whose name is not handed down with certainty, applied a hit-and-run tactic, hitting the sides of the most advanced ships and retreating before the Roman formation could close. The action had a notable psychological effect. It demonstrated that Carthage, although surrounded, had not lost the ability to maneuver on the sea. It was not a decisive battle, but an episode that forced the Roman fleet to maintain constant vigilance, further increasing the logistical burden of the campaign. Piso, however, did not give up the attempt to break this maritime bulwark. He ordered the construction of floating towers and platforms armed with catapults, but the rough seas and local currents made these structures almost unusable. Every approach to the port was countered with projectiles launched from the walls and towers that dominated the entrance. Numerous Roman engineers lost their lives attempting to place containment dikes, and the plan for an immediate naval takeover was eventually put on hold. The difficulties encountered by the consuls had profound consequences on the morale of the troops. The previous year had offered at least some minor victories, but 148 proved to be a sequence of unproductive efforts. Diseases, once again, weakened the cohorts. The enemy elephants, although less numerous than in the past, represented a constant fear during the Carthaginian sorties, as they could suddenly appear from a secondary gate and overwhelm isolated units. Piso himself, too often hesitant and not very versatile in managing maneuvers, was perceived as unsuitable for conducting a war that required flexibility and audacity. Carthage, on the other hand, although weakened by losses and finite resources, was experiencing a moment of renewed fervor. The population actively participated in the defense. Young, elderly, artisans, traders, everyone shared the work on the walls. The workshops continued to produce weapons unabated. Women carried stones and water to put out fires. The elders recounted their past deeds as a warning not to give in. The nights were illuminated by the fires of the Roman outposts and by the flashes of the torches on the Punic towers. It seemed that the city itself, with its ancient stones and its sea wind, breathed together with its defenders. Towards the end of 148, Rome realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. The losses accumulated without obtaining tangible results, the discontent of the troops, the progressive inefficiency of the consuls and the risk of a conflict that could continue for years pushed the Senate to consider a radical change. The African campaign needed a commander with discipline, vision, and moral authority, someone capable of transforming stagnation into an inexorable march towards victory. The figure destined for this task was already present in the collective memory of the city. Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, nephew by adoption of the great Africanus. 148 therefore ended with a fragile balance, but not without latent tension. Carthage had resisted beyond predictions, keeping its walls and its will intact. The Romans understood that they had underestimated the enemy and the complexity of the siege. The stage was set for the decisive turning point. The arrival of Scipio would have changed the fate of the war and of the entire Mediterranean. The arrival of Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus in Africa in 147 BC, it represented the turning point that Rome was waiting for, an event that changed the very pace of the war. The army, now worn out by 2 years of fruitless attempts, welcomed the new commander with a mixture of hope and awe. Scipio carried with him the weight of the name of the Scipios, a legacy that evoked the victory in the Second Punic War and at the same time the responsibility of living up to one's lineage. The army knew his iron discipline and his sober determination. No indulgence, no vain waste of men or means, only a declared and unavoidable objective, the fall of Carthage. The new commander's first act was of a moral and organizational nature, rather than military. The legions were weakened by the discontinuity of previous commands, hardened by useless efforts, exposed for months to diseases, night assaults, and to a campaign that seemed not to advance. Scipio, after having noted disorder in the ranks, immediately put an end to the abuses, re-established regular shifts, imposed strict controls on the defense of the camps, reorganized the auxiliary units and reduced the weight of the mobile infrastructures which only slowed down the marches. Many of those who had served under Piso saw the internal climate change radically. Every waste was punished, every escape from one's responsibilities was rigorously corrected, while the commander showed a personal example of sobriety, sleeping among the soldiers and limiting his own equipment. This disciplinary rebirth gave consistency to the maniples and rekindled the feeling of invincibility that had been characteristic of the legions in previous decades. Meanwhile, Carthage observed the succession of Roman commands with a mixture of obstinacy and apprehension. Hasdrubal the Boeotarch, who had orchestrated the resistance up to that point, continued to lead the defense with clarity, but he knew that tenacity would not be enough against a methodical opponent like Scipio. The walls were still intact, but supplies were starting to dwindle and the civic population, although animated by a strong sense of identity, was starting to show tiredness. The sorties that had annoyed the legions so much in the previous months were gradually reduced, as if the city had perceived the arrival of a new adversary capable of taking advantage of every mistake. Scipio, aware of the difficulty of the undertaking, refused to immediately launch an assault on the city. He did not want to repeat the failed tactics of his predecessors. Instead, he preferred to isolate Carthage, progressively reducing its ability to receive support from the surrounding regions. The first move was directed towards Nephrys, a fortified center that had long served as a supply base for the Carthaginians. In that area Hasdrubal had gathered heterogeneous troops, with African militias, contingents of citizen infantry, and some light cavalry units. The position was naturally defended by damp terrain and a system of canals which made maneuvering by heavy forces difficult. Scipio studied the terrain carefully, avoided the most predictable routes and chose a less direct but more controllable axis of advance. He ordered his units to maintain compact order, preventing any dispersion in the marshy areas. When he reached the chosen area, he observed that the Punic army had assumed a rigid defensive formation, convinced that the Romans would get bogged down in the same way they had done in previous years. It was here that Scipio demonstrated his tactical skill. He simulated a retreat, as if the terrain had put his soldiers in difficulty. Hasdrubal, deceived by the apparent enemy hesitancy, pushed his lines forward, eager to seize the opportunity. When the Punics passed a slightly elevated area, the Romans quickly turned around, closing ranks. The first cohort stabilized, while the next two lines wrapped like an inevitable wave on the flanks of the Punic formation. The chronology of the battle shows a very rapid crescendo. The first skirmishes did not last long, then followed hours of hand-to-hand combat, with the Roman shields advancing as a unified mass. The Punic infantry, lacking space to maneuver, was forced to retreat. Hasdrubal's men tried to reorganize, but the terrain did not allow an orderly retreat. By the time the Roman third line went into action, the battle was decided. The Punics dispersed in several directions, chased by the lighter groups who completed the annihilation. Nephrys fell shortly thereafter, marking the first significant strategic blow of the new campaign. The victory had an immediate impact. Carthage understood that the new Roman commander would leave no room for improvisation. The outermost garrisons were withdrawn towards the city, while growing fear pushed many to begin a more frantic defense. Scipio granted no respite. He continued his isolation plan, focusing on supply routes. He returned to Bagradas, a place that had seen the Roman defeat the previous year, knowing that the memory of the failure would be an incentive for his troops. Here, he found Hasdrubal busy fortifying some positions, but the Punic enthusiasm was already showing signs of weakening. The sight of the Roman army, more disciplined and orderly than ever, created disturbance among the Carthaginian ranks. The recapture of the Bagradas camp occurred more quickly than expected. Scipio used lighter mobile towers and catapults redesigned to operate in mixed terrain. The advance proceeded with almost geometric precision. The Romans, without unnecessary haste, reduced the Punic positions one after the other, taking advantage of alternating cover and advances. The confrontation was tough, but not chaotic. Asdrubal attempted a tenacious defense, but realizing that the terrain did not allow him to replicate the victorious maneuver of the previous year, he retreated towards the city. The Bagradas thus returned to Roman control, depriving Carthage of a further point of maneuver. The Carthaginian population perceived the difference. It was no longer a war of slowdowns, but of constant compression. The walls were still solid, but the circle was closing. Scipio began to prepare the actual siege, taking advantage of his superiority in logistics. He placed fixed outposts, established well-defended supply chains, built new siege engines from wood collected from surrounding regions. Carthage, although determined to resist, was beginning to suffer from a lack of cereals and wood, while morale was beginning to crack under the growing pressure. The Roman commander, without making impulsive gestures, dedicated himself to the slow but inexorable construction of the vice destined to suffocate the city. The troops quickly learned the new provisions: rigorous guard shifts, controlled movements, no unauthorized personal initiatives. Every step was considered, every position conquered was immediately fortified. War was no longer a series of random attempts, but a methodical process of demolishing the enemy. By the end of 147, the situation now appeared clear. Carthage, although still majestic in its walls and port structures, was isolated as it had never been before. The city was preparing, with growing desperation, for the inevitable direct confrontation. Scipio, with imperturbable calm, was simply waiting for the right moment to launch the assault that would open a new phase of the war. The following year would be the year in which the grip would truly close, bringing the conflict to its peak. When 147 came to an end and the new year dawned on Africa, Carthage found itself chained in a vice that tightened step by step. Scipio's work had radically changed the character of the war, no longer a series of fruitless attempts, but a slowly compressing siege, in which every escape route was patiently closed, and every margin for maneuver reduced to almost nothing. 146 BC thus began a time of growing anguish for the Punic city, still supported by its pride but weakened by months of deprivation. The very air seemed imbued with an almost tangible tension, as if even the wind carried with it the premonition of the end. Scipione immediately began to focus his work on the port area. The Carthage, with its complex system of internal basins and the passage that led to the open sea, represented a symbol of pride and a military bulwark. Although Carthage could no longer boast a large fleet, the span of its maritime facilities remained extraordinary. The towers located at the entrance to the port monitored the waters with stubborn silence, and every night a trail of torches illuminated the ramparts, marking the presence of the defenders as a warning to the Romans. Scipio had studied those walls and those canals in great detail. He knew that the capture of the port would represent a lethal blow for the city, because it would break the last link with the sea and force the Carthaginians to concentrate their energies exclusively on land defense. For this reason he decided to begin preparations for a complex assault, which would require coordination between the land legions and the fleet. However, he did not seek a sudden attack. He preferred to consolidate the positions around the hills that dominated the port area, building trenches, palisades, and siege platforms. Every day mobile towers, catapults, and solid wooden tortoises were brought closer, while the soldiers worked in silence, aware that every plank, every stone, would be part of the final assault. Meanwhile Carthage, although aware of the imminent danger, did not remain inactive. The workshops that remained active incessantly produced projectiles for ballistae and pieces of wood intended to strengthen the port gates. Women carried jars of water up the walls to put out enemy fires, while young men were trained to throw javelins from the top of the towers. Inside the Carthage docks, some ships, although worn, were still kept operational in case the opportunity for a sudden sortie arose. But the era of Punic naval maneuvers had now reached its twilight. The Roman fleet dominated the surrounding waters and prevented any attempt to escape or supply. The preparation of the assault on the port took weeks, during which the Romans gave the defenders no respite. Light catapults were brought forward to strike the outer walls of the Carthage. Archers created corridors of fire to hinder the work of the Punics. Special teams attempted to undermine the foundations of the towers. The Carthaginian response was energetic. Every Roman advance was greeted by a rain of stones and incendiary projectiles. The Punic towers responded with concentrated fire. The ships moored in the inner harbor tried to hit the floating structures that the Romans were trying to push towards the entrance. The battle, at this stage, became a long struggle of resistance, fought across the waters, on the stones of the walls and in the muddy lands around the docks. The decisive moment came when Scipio, having noted the impossibility of conquering the main entrance with a frontal impact, chose a bolder maneuver. He had an embankment built along the outer waters of the port, from which the final assault could be launched. Under the protection of the great tortoises, his soldiers advanced inch by inch. Roman engineers, expert at manipulating unstable terrain, managed to establish a platform that allowed the legions to achieve a dominant position on the coastal barriers. The defenders, realizing the maneuver, intensified the fire of their machines, but were unable to prevent the Romans from placing siege towers close to the external walls. The assault was violent and incessant. Scipio's men climbed the opposing towers, clashed with the defenders in a confined and chaotic space, while the Roman fleet contributed from the outside by bombarding the weakest points of the fortifications. Carthage put up a desperate resistance, worthy of its history. The defenders, although exhausted, continued to throw stones, burning wood and javelins. But the organizational superiority of the Romans ended up prevailing. When the first Roman units managed to overcome the parapet and establish themselves on the internal docks, the battle entered a new and irreversible phase. The Punics, surrounded, retreated towards the interior of the port, burning ships to prevent them from falling intact into enemy hands. The conquest of the port marked the end of the last illusion of naval self-defense. Once this bulwark collapsed, Carthage was forced to concentrate entirely on land defense. But even its imposing walls, built in times of prosperity and power, were beginning to show cracks under the constant pressure of the siege. Scipio ordered to consolidate the corridor conquered in the port, strengthening it as a support base for subsequent operations. His troops advanced towards the western area of the walls, a particularly exposed section and already marked by the hits of the Roman machines. The breach that the Romans sought to open did not arise with a single blow, but as the result of days and nights of bombings, excavations, controlled fires and close-quarters assaults. The defenders fought with an almost superhuman intensity. Some historiographers report that entire families took part in the defense of the section of the wall closest to their homes, determined to resist to the last. But the strength of the artifact could not resist the constant pounding of the Roman machines. In the end, a portion of the Great Wall collapsed with a crash that could be heard throughout the city. Blocks of stone slipped in the dust, leaving a gap wide enough for several maniples to pass side by side. The Romans, led by Scipio, entered the neighborhood of Megara, an area full of gardens and villas, once a prosperous suburb and today transformed into an internal defense zone. The Carthaginian resistance therefore moved from the walls to the urban fabric, where every street, every garden, every wall could become a point of support. The legions advanced with extreme caution, because the Punics knew the terrain and moved with impressive speed through secondary streets and hidden passages. The Roman advance was slow but inexorable. The soldiers proceeded house to house, breaking down doors, opening holes in the dividing walls and using shields above their heads to protect themselves from shots coming from the roofs. Megara became the scene of close and cruel combat. Every block was contested. Each group of defenders tried to slow down the Roman progression as much as possible, knowing that Scipio's final objective was the heart of the city, the citadel of Byrsa. Despite desperate resistance, Roman superiority in coordination and discipline allowed them to consolidate increasingly advanced positions. Scipio erected improvised barricades to protect the conquered points, transforming each advance into a stable base from which to launch the next attack. In the meantime, the civilian population, overwhelmed by the chaos, sought refuge in the more internal areas. The streets of Megara, once full of daily life, became corridors of rubble. Yet despite the growing sense of encirclement, Carthage showed no sign of surrender. The obstinacy of its inhabitants prolonged the battle, making any Roman progress a sacrifice. But Scipio was in no hurry. He knew that the city, now isolated by the sea and deprived of its peripheral defenses, was destined to fall. His objective was to avoid unnecessary dispersions of men and maintain constant tension until the final collapse. Thus, as the days progressed, the simple siege phase transformed into a tense urban struggle, which would define the next part of the campaign. 146 was not yet halfway through, and it was already clear that the conflict was approaching its climax. The city, hit in its vital structures, was about to face the most desperate and ferocious phase of its history. The outer walls had fallen, the port was lost, and the legions were now advancing towards the symbolic and religious heart of Carthage. The battle now moved to the internal streets, between houses, sanctuaries and sacred architecture, where the population would fight as a single body driven by desperation. And in that struggle, the city's grandeur and tragedy would emerge with even greater intensity. When the Roman legions definitively consolidated control over Megara, the war entered a new, almost claustrophobic dimension. The siege was no longer a circle that tightened around the city. Now it was a struggle that took place within it, among corridors of rubble, narrow and steep streets, devastated gardens and homes transformed into improvised bastions. The population, overwhelmed and at the same time determined, was mainly concentrated in the sacred and fortified area of Byrsa, the religious, political and symbolic heart of Carthage. Its internal walls, although less imposing than the external defenses that had collapsed in the previous months, still stood tall with their solemnity, as the last barrier between the city and its final destruction. Byrsa represented the last refuge, but also the last theater of a confrontation destined to be imprinted in the memory of the ancient world. Scipio Aemilianus, aware that the final phase would be the hardest, imposed an advanced and meticulous method to penetrate the urban fabric. His troops were not to proceed only along the main roads, where the defenders could easily strike them from the rooftops, but they were to transform the city itself into a battlefield of their own design. Thus began the action that Roman historiographers described as a continuous work of controlled demolition. The legionaries opened passages through the walls of the houses, connected adjacent houses, climbed to the upper floors to avoid ambushes and proceeded at the same time in a horizontal and vertical line. The city was dissolved from the inside, as if an organism was dismembered branch by branch to reach the heart. The Carthaginian defense, although now deprived of material means, continued with ferocious tenacity. The families who had taken refuge in Byrsa collaborated with the fighters, passing stones, boiling oil, water to put out fires and javelins made from pieces of furniture. The arches of the houses served as firing positions, the roofs as platforms from which to launch anything that could slow down the Roman advance. The steepest streets, which led from the lower area of the neighborhood to the upper terraces of the hill, became real battle tunnels, where each defensive group aimed to wear down the attackers by continuously striking and retreating. The Romans adopted a strategy which, although costly in energy, reduced the risk of catastrophic losses, advancing only after having firmly consolidated the previous stretch. Each conquered block was immediately occupied by groups tasked with ensuring the safety of the flanks, while the units destined to lead the advance moved towards the still contested areas. The battle no longer had a clear front, but broke into dozens of simultaneous clashes, fought amidst the smoke of the fires, the noise of falling stones and the clang of weapons. The city, consumed by the long siege, seemed to transform into a labyrinth where life and death collided at every step. The most critical point of the Roman advance was reached when the legions reached the imposing stairways that led to the summit of Byrsa. These stairs, a symbol of Carthaginian architecture and usually used by priests and magistrates, were transformed by the defenders into a complex trap ground. The steps were doused with water to make them slippery, stones were rolled from above, and groups of youths threw darts from elevated positions. The Romans, forced to move back with their shields above their heads, suffered losses but continued to press, advancing with unshakable determination. The image of those legions climbing up the steps, under a hail of shots, remained engraved in the memory of contemporaries as one of the hardest tests of the entire conflict. Meanwhile, Scipio maintained an overview of the battle, coordinating the assaults with a precision that Roman historians would later celebrate as a model of military discipline. His units were not to allow the defenders, using their knowledge of the terrain, to surround or isolate the advanced groups. Thus the Roman progression took the form of a fan-shaped movement, which progressively narrowed the range of action of the Punics and channeled their resistance towards the center of the hill. For the Carthaginians, every retreat meant losing an observation point, an elevated position, a shelter. Yet they did not give up, not even when the encirclement became evident. The most significant episode of this phase was the assault on the last houses before the main temple of Byrsa. The structures, solidly built, offered the last defenders a foothold to prolong their resistance. The Romans had to resort to mixed techniques: light battering rams to break down doors, ladders to reach the roofs, squads of velites to strike from high positions, and groups of heavy infantry to advance room after room. The houses became a sequence of small fortresses, each of which had to be conquered with a targeted action. The fires set by the Romans to force the defenders to abandon some positions clashed with Punic attempts to suffocate them by throwing sand and damp cloths from the windows. In many places the battle proceeded amidst smoke and ash, with the figures of the fighters emerging from the shadows like apparitions of a world now on the edge of existence. Scipio, observing the flames rising along some buildings, felt, according to the ancient chroniclers, a feeling of uneasiness, as if the destruction of the city was crossing a threshold beyond which not only Carthage would be lost, but also a part of the memory of the world. But he didn't hesitate. The logic of war dictated that resistance be broken completely, and any hesitation would only prolong the suffering of his own army. The final assault on the highest area of the citadel occurred when the Carthaginians, now without escape routes, concentrated their last fighters around the sacred complex. Temples, usually places of peace and prayer, were transformed into bastions where men, women, and elderly people united in an attempt to make sense of the last defense. The Roman infantry advanced in compact formation, while the siege engines, although difficult to maneuver in the narrow streets, continued to hit the points where the perimeter wall showed signs of failure. The conquest of Byrsa was a continuous crescendo. Each line of defense that fell revealed the next, smaller and smaller, closer and closer to the center. The Romans finally managed to reach the upper hill, where the defenders, exhausted, prepared for the final clash. The city's agony thus reached its final phase, with the majority of the population barricaded and no longer able to retreat. The hill, in the silence that followed one of the bloodiest clashes, seemed to remain still for a brief moment, as if the city was holding its breath knowing that its fate was about to be decided. The legions, positioned in a dominant position, observed the remains of the Punic defenses dissolving in smoke and debris. And precisely in this suspended tension it was felt that the culmination of the entire war was imminent, ready to explode in the final confrontation that would put an end to Rome's oldest rival and would mark the end of the Punic world. The curtain of the last battle was rising, and every figure, Roman or Carthaginian, was preparing to be part of the final scene. When Byrsa Hill remained isolated and silent after the last waves of fighting, the air of the city seemed to change in nature. It was no longer just the smoke of the fires that rose from the broken buildings, but a sort of panting of Carthage itself, as if the ancient metropolis felt that it had reached the extreme limit of its existence. The legions, reorganized after the extremely hard effort of the final climb, awaited Scipio's orders in a suspended, almost unreal atmosphere. The Roman general observed from above the rubble a city that no longer resembled its great rival of the past: interrupted streets, collapsed houses, gutted roofs, and all around an echo of distant voices, perhaps moaning, perhaps simple wind among the blackened marble. But in the center of this scene, still intact and compact like a last bastion, rose the summit of Byrsa, where the Carthaginian survivors had gathered as if in a sanctuary of desperate obstinacy. In the heart of that last refuge there were thousands of people, not only fighters but entire families who had followed the internal retreat in the hope of finding protection behind the sacred structures. The storms of fighting in the lower streets had pushed everyone upwards, like a great human river flowing into the central fortress. The younger men had collected what remained of the weapons, from spears still intact to short daggers forged in the workshops improvised during the siege. The women, exhausted yet resolute, distributed water as they tried to soothe wounds that could not be healed. A strange order existed around the main temple, as if the ancient spirit of the city was imposing a final form of discipline on its children. Scipio did not intend to launch the definitive assault immediately. He carefully studied the position, the ramps that led to the center of the fortress, the embankments that the defenders had reinforced with materials taken from nearby houses. His troops, although victorious, were tired and worn out by the incessant series of urban clashes. He therefore decided to grant a few hours of break, but not a respite. The catapults were positioned on the highest points of the conquered areas, and the archers placed along the edges of the lower terraces, ready to prevent any sortie by the Punics. A tight line of Roman shields now marked the only access to the citadel. It was evident that the sacred hill had remained cut off from the rest of the world. The night preceding the assault was probably one of the most tense of the entire war. From the lower terraces, the Romans sometimes heard soft songs coming from the top. Some ancient historiographers claim that they were prayers to the tutelary deities of the city, others speak of invocations to the deceased, still others of simple attempts to instill courage in the youngest. Whatever the truth, those voices pierced the darkness with an almost supernatural force, and the Roman soldiers themselves listened to them in silence, aware that that would be the last night of the great Carthage. At dawn Scipio gave the order to bring the rams and ladders closer. The African sky, clear and hard as a sheet of metal, watched silently as the legions positioned themselves along the ramps leading towards the sacred complex. The commanders of the maniples reminded their men that resistance might be desperate, but that the position of the Punics no longer allowed unpredictable maneuvers. The infantry advanced with geometric discipline, shield to shield, throwers and archers ready to respond to the slightest movement. The defenders of Byrsa, when they saw the first Roman contingents approaching, immediately unleashed a rain of stones, javelins and objects of all kinds. It was the gesture of a city that no longer had anything to spare, and that transformed every fragment of its existence into a weapon. The clash began with a roar that enveloped the hill. The Romans advanced under the shelter of their shields, while the first shots of the rams hammered the barriers erected by the Carthaginians around the heart of the fortress. The impacts produced vibrations that traveled through the structure to the foundations of the temple, and each rumble seemed to announce the approach of destruction. But the defenders did not allow themselves to be terrified. They formed compact lines behind the barricades and took every opportunity to strike. Some, the most daring, even attempted short counterattacks, trying to surprise the legionaries on the flanks, but were repelled by the implacable discipline of the Roman formations. The battle slowly turned into a melee. Once the first defenses had been broken, the Romans penetrated the open spaces in front of the temple, where an armed crowd had gathered as the last line of resistance. There the fighting, already ferocious in the lower streets of the city, reached levels of extreme drama. The difference between soldiers and civilians almost dissolved. Necessity pushed everyone, regardless of age or condition, to raise improvised weapons, to throw themselves against the advance of those legions that did not seem to know tiredness. The ground became a tangle of bodies, broken shields and remnants of sacred structures that collapsed under the blows of the machines. Scipione observed from a slightly rearward position, ready to intervene if it was necessary to direct new departments at the point of greatest pressure. He was very clear that he must not allow the fight to degenerate into uncontrollable disorder. It was essential to keep the assault line compact, to prevent the impetus of the last Punic resistance from turning into chaos potentially harmful to his own men. For this reason he sent fresh groups of people alternately, giving the most tested ones the opportunity to momentarily retreat and reorganize. His observation skills, combined with an almost ritual calm, guided the legions with the effectiveness of a perfectly regulated mechanism. When the defenders were pushed back towards the innermost part of the complex, near the main temple, the action reached its peak. That building, the sacred heart of the city, was now surrounded by rubble. Some Carthaginians had barricaded themselves inside, perhaps hoping that the grandeur of the walls could resist for a few more hours. But the doors gave way under the battering rams, and the Romans broke into a room where men and women had gathered in silence, as if in an anticipated funeral ceremony. The scene impressed even the most experienced legionaries, accustomed to all forms of warfare. It was not an immediate massacre. Many of those present surrendered, aware of the futility of prolonging the fight inside a sacred place now desecrated by the noise of weapons. Others, however, continued to oppose, forcing the Roman soldiers into a delicate action, in which every blow, every step, had to be measured so as not to cause uncontrollable destruction. It was at this point that the Carthaginian resistance finally disintegrated. The survivors, seeing the heart of the fortress fall, understood that the city was now lost. The last pockets of fighters were quickly isolated and neutralized, while the Roman commanders rounded up the prisoners on the flat areas of the hill. Meanwhile, special groups of legionaries monitored every corner of the citadel to eliminate any residual risks. It was no longer a battle but an orderly conclusion, in which Rome ensured that nothing could rekindle the flame of resistance. As the late afternoon sun fell on the ruins of the temple, Scipio slowly climbed to the top of the hill. He stopped between the broken columns, observing the city from above. It was not a triumphal contemplation. The ancient chroniclers remember that it was a moment of reflection full of sadness, almost a premonition of the fate that awaited that place. The streets that had once hosted merchants, priests and citizens now appeared empty, interrupted by smoking fissures and piles of stones. The port, conquered a few weeks earlier, seemed like a dull shell. Some Roman ships bobbed calmly in the waters, but no other Punic boats plowed the dark surface of the sea anymore. Scipio understood that the task of war was finished. All that remained was to proceed as Rome had established. Shortly thereafter he would issue the orders that would forever reshape the destiny of the place. But that moment already belonged to another dimension of history. What had taken place in Byrsa was the final act of a dispute that had lasted generations, a clash that had pitted two civilizations and two visions of the world against one another. On that day, the last shadow of Carthaginian power dissolved on the still warm soil of the hill, and with it an entire chapter of the ancient Mediterranean. The Third Punic War ended thus, in the silence that follows the din, when the legions stopped and the city ceased to exist as a living entity. The decisions that followed, the fate of the survivors, the transformation of the territory, belong to the next part of the narrative. Here ends the last breath of the warrior Carthage, fallen in its most sacred fortress, under the eyes of a general who understood, better than anyone else, that the greatness of a victory does not erase the greatness of the civilization that is defeated.